I want to talk about Star Wars, and my friends and family have had enough, so now I'm going to talk to you. And today I want to talk about the end of Rise of Skywalker, and why I think the galaxy should be heading towards a Cold War. The other day, I was working on a video about the corner the writers have written themselves into at the end of the sequel era. What started this line of thought was the rumors circulating among some dissatisfied fans that Disney was considering a retcon of the sequel trilogy. If you haven't heard about it, don't worry, I've yet to see this reported on by any reputable news service, so it's not something you should be too concerned about, or excited for, depending on how you feel about the sequels. Anyways, part of the rumor was that Lucasfilm did not see the way forward after the trilogy, and I took a moment to think about if that made sense. I came up with a fairly long list of things I felt could be narrative constraints or problems that the writers would have to deal with in the future if they wanted to write something that followed the sequel trilogy. Things like some of the new Force abilities, particularly Force healing. How Force ghosts can do more than just impart wisdom or explain why what they said in the previous movie was true.
From a certain point of view.
How using the Force doesn't require significant training anymore. All we need now is someone who is strong with the Force to suddenly become aware that it exists, and we go from someone thinking that it's a myth to doing something that we've only seen the most powerful Force users do in about a week. But we can take all of that and push it off to the side, because what really got the gears of my brain turning is the general state of the galaxy. At the end of Return of the Jedi, we had a decapitated Empire facing off against the Rebel Alliance, who, it should be noted, had civilian leadership like Mon Mothma ready to step in. Remember also that the Galactic Senate was still a thing only a few years prior to this. The point is, the structure and the institutional memory is there, and the path towards the restoration of the Republic is a lot easier to see. Fast forward to the end of Rise of Skywalker, and what do we have? Who does the Resistance have? As near as I can tell, after Leia's death, the leaders of the Resistance are Generals Poe and Finn.
Thank you. I appreciate that. General?
The briefing before the final battle in Return of the Jedi is led by Mon Mothma, making it clear that the military component of the rebellion gets its marching orders from the civilian political organization of the rebellion. If we look back in our own history, we can see this as well. During the American Revolution, George Washington wasn't running around by himself. He had to answer to the Continental Congress. The Resistance does not have this, as it is Poe and Finn who give out the orders before the final battle on Exegol. In The Force Awakens, the Resistance had an ambiguous relationship with the New Republic, but the political organization of the New Republic was completely wiped out in the Hosnian incident. The Resistance does not have civilian leadership, nor do they have the institutional memory needed to reform the Republic or something like it. The only one among them with any sort of governing experience is Lando. And that brings us to Lando's fleet. Now, I am among the group of people who found Lando's rapid assembly of such a large fleet to be a bit of a stretch, but let's ignore that and just accept that it happened. They responded to defeat the ultimate threat of Palpatine and his superweapons, but what do they do now? Do they stay together to fight what remains of the First Order? Or do they all go back to their systems and do their own thing? A force assembled with such haste would not have the supplies or the coordination for more than one or two engagements. This is undeniably a vast improvement in the situation of the Resistance, as they have new allies and at least some of them would be willing to assist further, but I find it difficult to see them building a coordinated effort to drive out the First Order in a short amount of time. Speaking of the First Order, what is their situation? Before I began to write this, I watched the end of Rise of Skywalker again, and it doesn't appear to me that the First Order sent more than General Pryde's ship to Exegol. So the rest of their fleet and their support infrastructure is still out there. We see shots of Star Destroyers going down over Bespin and Endor, symbolizing the general uprising that Rose mentions, but these are places they occupied in The Last Jedi, not the places they controlled at the beginning of The Force Awakens. Due to the lack of world building, the extent of their resources and infrastructure is unclear, but they seem to be unhindered by significant losses. Remember, Starkiller Base was destroyed, and then 2 days later the First Order reigned, like its loss wasn't a big deal, as if maybe they didn't keep all their resources in one place, unlike some other people. Just saying. My point here is that the majority of the First Order is still out there. Their Sith leadership is now completely gone, but that didn't seem to be a problem. Snoke died, and Kylo took over without too much fuss. General Pryde stepped in the moment Kylo decided he needed to start his redemption arc. So I feel safe in saying there's probably other Imperial veterans ready to step up and take command. In which case, we're back to the Galactic Civil War after the Return of the Jedi. So what's going to be different this time? This time, I feel like the Rebellion, or the Resistance, is in a much worse situation than they were in Return of the Jedi, and the future seems much more open-ended. Do we get a New Republic, or does everyone do their own thing? Do they keep fighting until the First Order is eliminated, or do they go for another treaty? In which case, how do we not do this again in 30 years? And then I thought about one of the other problems I'd highlighted, and how it might actually be a solution and a way to take Star Wars in a new and interesting direction. That problem was the power creep of weapons in the sequel trilogy. In the original trilogy, we had super lasers that were powered by bases the size of a small moon that required many years and the resources of an entire empire to construct. In The Force Awakens, we had an actual moon that fired hyperspace lasers that were powered by draining a star. Speaking of, I'm currently working on another video about that, but I'm having to do a lot of research on astrophysics and math and stuff, which has never been my strong suit, so that might take a while. In The Rise of Skywalker, we've gone in a different direction. The Death Star has been democratized in the form of the Zeiston-class Star Destroyers, each one on its own capable of destroying a planet. So what happened to all of those weapons? Weren't there about 1,000 of these things on Exegol? Did they blow up 1,000 Star Destroyers? For the moment, let's be generous and say that they did. We could also be generous and assume that the Sith Eternal just didn't bother to keep any records or blueprints on how they made this stuff. Even with all that, the technological breakthrough that made these weapons possible still happened. If someone was determined enough, they could figure out how these weapons worked and reverse engineer them, and then we're off to the races. Now, any capital ship is a potential planet killer. A planet-killing weapon is the ultimate weapon in the Star Wars universe. If you want to have stakes on a galactic scale, you can't threaten a ship or a village, you have to threaten a planet. Our real-world equivalent would be a nuke. That is our ultimate weapon. The Empire with the Death Star is like the US at the end of World War II. No other great power was going to mess with us, not when we were the only ones with a superweapon. And then someone else got a superweapon. And then another, and then another, and then another. Good walls, or in this case good superweapons, make for good neighbors. What followed was called the Cold War, with two sides suspiciously watching each other, while the unaffiliated countries of the world nervously watched them, with the existential dread of nuclear annihilation playing softly in the background. But this also came to be called the Long Peace, a period marked by the absence of major wars between the great powers of the world, something unseen in human history since the height of the Roman Empire. Now, the Long Peace wasn't entirely a result of the deterrence of nuclear weapons, because this so-called Long Peace continued after the Cold War ended, but they were still an important factor. With the democratization and the dissemination of the Death Star technology, I think the Star Wars universe could be headed for a Cold War. And at first I thought this was a problem. If both sides are facing annihilation, the next war would be the last war, so there can't be a next war. So in the future, how do we have a conflict on a galactic scale? It's called Star Wars, not Star Peace. But then I went over this idea with my Star Wars buddy, who has been a much bigger fan for much longer than I have, and he thought this was a very interesting prospect. You see, in every trilogy, there has been a struggle between good and evil. However, one side has always been dominant over the other. In the prequels, the good guys were in charge, and then they were defeated by the bad guys. In the original trilogy, the bad guys were in power, until they were defeated, we thought, by the good guys. Now, in the sequel trilogy, I would argue that we still don't really have parity between the good guys and the bad guys, because the New Republic doesn't have a superweapon, and they are also immediately wiped out in one attack. Whereas, as I've said before, the loss of Starkiller Base does nothing to prevent the First Order from dominating the galaxy. So now, if both sides have access to superweapons and we can no longer go to war, we have, for the first time since the Old Republic, both good and evil on equal footing. We have Star Cold Wars, and think of all the possibilities that opens up. Without a Sith at the helm, maybe the First Order will settle down, focus on governing the unknown regions, and leave the rest of the galaxy with their own planet-killing lasers alone. The conflict on a galactic scale wouldn't be war, it would be the prevention of war. We could have a situation where the conflict escalates to the brink of war, and the good guys and the bad guys might have to team up to stop that. We could have our own Star Wars version of James Bond, spying on the First Order, playing sabacc, and seducing whatever this thing is. Can anyone think of a character who might be well suited for this? Someone whose background has given them knowledge of how the First Order operates. Someone who can pull off risky operations behind enemy lines, or can put on a cover story and pretend to be someone else. Someone who knows where the server rooms are located. Someone whose character wasn't really well explored or didn't live up to their full potential. No? Nothing? Alright, we'll come back to that. If anything, I see this development as something that may force the writers to be more creative, as they can't really go back to the well and say, the bad guys can blow up planets. Again. They'd have to do something like the bad guys want to blow up the galaxy or something equally ridiculous.
I'll try spinning. That's a good trick.
Just think of all the interesting fiction that came out of the Cold War and how that could be adapted to Star Wars. We could have a movie where the First Order develops a new type of stealthy dreadnought, upsetting the balance of power in the galaxy. The New Republic sees a flurry of activity in First Order space as the dreadnought disappears. Fearing that the First Order captain has gone rogue, the New Republic panics, deploys their own fleets, and now we're at the brink of war. Then suddenly, some guy in the intelligence service, I don't know, we'll go with, say, this guy, comes up with a wild theory that the dreadnought captain is actually trying to defect. The Hunt for the Red Dreadnought in theaters 2022. That's a terrible idea. Don't make that movie. But my point is, you can have drama without a full-scale war. But we're still talking on a galactic scale here, and I think that this development may force the writers to make the story smaller. I don't mean make the universe smaller. I mean it doesn't have to be a galaxy-sized problem for the audience to be interested. The Skywalker saga has always been a conflict on a galactic scale. The Mandalorian is much smaller in scope. The Skywalker saga is CNN. The Mandalorian is the 5 o'clock news. It's local, and you know what? For the most part, people seem to like it. The success of The Mandalorian proves we don't need galactic-scale problems to be interested in Star Wars, and in truth, we never did. The galactic problems were always the background to our characters, who are what we actually care about. As long as they can deliver characters that we are interested in, we will be interested in whatever conflicts they get into, be they large or small. And small might be the way forward. Now, I'm not saying that this is how it will go, or even how it should go, but I look at the board and the pieces on it, and this is what I see. I see a new problem for the universe and a solution that offers some interesting possibilities for the future. So maybe the writers don't need to worry about how they could possibly top the threat of 1,000 planet-killing ships. Maybe they could focus on something smaller than the never-ending tug-of-war between the Sith and the Jedi. And maybe next time, they can show us something new. If you made it this far in the video, I thank you very much for sticking around and listening to what I had to say. I'd also appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up or the thumbs down button, depending on how you felt. Your feedback is important to me. Also, if enough of you hit that subscribe button, I just might be inclined to do some more of these videos. I have an ever-expanding list of Star Wars things that I'd like to talk about at some point. But that's all I got for you today. I thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you next time, and may the Force be with you, always.
Every word of what you just said was wrong.